When I talk about midwifery, I often will refer to the term fire in the belly. This refers to a sacred fire like the one you see in the painting by Anishinaabe artist Mark Jacobson. Birth is the highest ceremony in my culture, and every other ceremony we do is to recreate, to emulate, or to connect us back to birth. The sweat lodge is a lodge or a small structure with a pit in the middle where heated stones are placed and the door is closed, and then water is sprinkled on them, creating a dark, wet, warm environment, much like a room. The painting shows that ceremony as it's intended and reflects an Indigenous worldview, a connection to our first environment. And it's an example of how the land and our bodies are inextricably linked. The ceremony is a literal fire in the belly. The Cree word, which is my language, for woman is iskweu, which is related to the word for fire, which is iskoteo. Acknowledging that women carry the fire of being a life giver and someone able to bring forward new life. So it's our responsibility to keep watch and to care for the fires in our homes and in our bodies. Another meaning of the term fire in the belly refers to someone's emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical determination. It's a different kind of sacred fire, but one no less important and particularly relevant to the practice of Indigenous midwifery. The fire in my belly is to see not just the survival of Indigenous peoples, but to uphold the integrity of Indigenous survival and to welcome with my own hands into the hands of other Indigenous midwives, our future ancestors. Despite vastly different lands, histories, and cultures of Indigenous nations and peoples in the Americas, it's shocking how closely aligned our common goals are when it comes to midwifery. From my relationships and opportunities I've had to meet and work with Indigenous midwives from Mexico, Peru, Paraguay, Chile, Guatemala, USA, and from all parts of Canada, Indigenous midwives are continually put in the position to advocate for their own legitimacy, for respect and recognition of knowledge, practice, and skills. They're meant to advocate against criminalization in recognition of their rights. I want to tell you a story that illustrates how self-determined Indigenous midwifery brings well-being back to a community level. The first place in Canada which established sanctioned midwifery services was Puvunatuq, which is an Inuit community along the Hudson Bay coast in the Nunavik region of Quebec. Under every definition, this is considered a remote location. It takes approximately 4 hours by plane to transfer it to the nearest center with a hospital. The Inuit women there were growing very tired of flying out of their community at 36 weeks to a city thousands of kilometers away, to give birth alone and without their families and surrounded by people who could not speak their language, and they were often treated very badly. This evacuation policy, as it's referred to, is not actually a written policy, but it's a common practice for Indigenous peoples giving birth, and it's still happening today in Canada. So I want to share a quote from a Tsleil-Waututh elder by the name of Giuseppe Pedaliat, and they said, "I can understand that some of you may think that birth in remote areas is dangerous, and we have made it clear what it means for our women to birth in our communities. And you must know that a life without meaning is much more dangerous." So birth happening outside of the community was actually killing them. In Puvunatuq, they started to hide when the plane came, or they just would refuse to go. Most of the older Inuit had been born on the land, as they called it, so there was a living memory of Indigenous midwifery. Today, more than 30 years later, it's the Inuit midwives leading interdisciplinary teams of providers who deliver about 89% of babies born in that region in 4 different maternities up and down the coast. The cesarean rate is less than 3%, which is nothing short of incredible. Alongside the clinical program, the Inuit midwives created an education program where local women learn to be midwives using their own language and at their own pace, and they graduate after passing a hands-on and verbal exam. In the beginning of the program, there was many non-Inuit midwives from the south that came up to work and to teach, some who still regularly make the trip over 30 years later. The majority of teachers are now Inuit, and they're graduates of the program who are registered with the provincial regulator. Six Nations is an Indigenous reservation in southern Ontario. And they've run a community-based education program for over 20 years that's taught entirely by Haudenosaunee midwives. And some of those graduates have gone on to create programs in their own home communities as well. These Indigenous-led community-based programs are creating access to midwifery education that supports Indigenous identity while providing a quality, culturally safe care for their clients. Sadly, Indigenous peoples in almost every country are underrepresented in all levels of education. So how do we make education more accessible to Indigenous people? First, you allow Indigenous people to lead and provide support to articulate the already existing forms of education. Second is that you value oral transmission of knowledge and hands-on learning. The next thing you can do is to build a relationship with Indigenous communities without any assumptions. And you invite practicing Indigenous midwives into already existing programs. Education should not put someone in a situation where they feel they need to choose between being educated and being Indigenous. And yet, across the Americas, that is a common experience for Indigenous midwifery students. The Indigenous Midwifery Project, funded by PWRDF between 2016 and 2019, focused on many common areas. Our methodology and approach was relational, iterative, strength-based, decolonial, evidence-based, and collaborative. This included things such as identifying wise practices, reviewing curriculum, articulating community-based systems of regulation, creating tools for knowledge transmission, knowledge exchange between midwives, the training of new Indigenous midwives, and working together to advocate and create advocacy tools. One of the first things that we did as a collective across the 3 countries was to create a common survey, which each organization took and asked the Indigenous midwives the same questions, including, for example, how often do you see a pregnant person and why do you see them that often? What do you do when you and other midwives get together? What do you do when someone's water breaks before labor? The consistencies across the 3 countries were quite astounding and demonstrated intact systems that supported safe practice, such as defined schedule of visits, regular practicing of skills in a group, and a very clear scope of practice. I am a member of the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. It's an autonomous organization of Indigenous midwives currently living in Canada. We're made up of different Indigenous nations, including the Inuit from the north, Anishinaabe, Mi'kmaq midwives, Métis midwives. Some of us are regulated by provincial colleges or territorial colleges, while others, including myself, are regulated by community-based systems. We agreed on 10 core values of Indigenous midwifery, and one of which is clinical excellence. That core value reads, Indigenous midwives uphold the standard and principles of exemplary clinical care for women and babies across the life cycle. This includes reproductive health care, well women and baby care, and the creation of sacred and powerful spaces for Indigenous girls, women, families, and communities. This core value is so significant because too often and for too long, governments and institutions have assumed that first, Indigenous people are not worthy of excellent care, and second, Indigenous midwives do not have excellent clinical skills. This is just as true in Canada as it is in Mexico or Peru. Another common fact is that I can confidently tell you that Indigenous people in each of these countries consistently experience the biggest health outcomes and disparities. And I'm here to say that Indigenous midwives have skills well beyond pregnancy and birth that can contribute to improved community health and well-being.